All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening. Okay. Welcome out to the museum. My name is Morgan Gifford, and I am the STEM Education Manager for the Atomic Museum. We are very excited to have you out tonight. On behalf of the museum staff and the Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation, I would like to welcome you all to tonight's distinguished lecture featuring Dr. Margaret Weitekamp. Dr. Weitekamp serves as chair for the Space History Department at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum and curates the museum's social and cultural history of spaceflight collection, which includes more than 5,000 artifacts, including both memorabilia and space science fiction objects. These everyday mementos of the space age, which include toys and games, medals and awards, buttons and pins, and comics and trading cards, complete the story about spaceflight told by the museum's collection of space hardware and technologies. Her book, Space Craze, America's Enduring Fascination with Real and Imagined Spaceflight, is based on that work. And that book we also have available for purchase in the gift shop, and we'll have time afterwards for signing if you are interested. With Matthew Schindel, she revised and expanded Spaceships, an illustrated history of the real and imagined. She is the author of numerous scholarly articles, as well as Right Stuff, Wrong Sex, America's First Women in Space program, which won the Eugene M. Emmy Award for Astronautical Literature from the American Astronautical Society. In addition, she wrote an award-winning children's book, Pluto's Secret, An Icy World's Tale of Discovery, in collaboration with David Dvorkin, with illustrations by Diane Kidd. Weitekamp earned a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Pittsburgh, as well as a Master's and Ph.D. in History from Cornell University. During her graduate work, she was a Mellon Fellow in the Humanities and spent a year in residence at the NASA Headquarters History Office in Washington, D.C. as the American Historical Association and NASA Aerospace History Fellow. Before joining the Smithsonian, she taught in the Women's Studies program at Hobart and William Smith College. Dr. Weitekamp is happy to answer audience questions at the conclusion of her talk. We do ask that you would wait for a microphone just so that all of our audience, both in person as well as on Zoom, can hear your question. So if you would like to ask a question, please just raise your hand and wait for us to bring you a microphone. If you are on Zoom and would like to ask a question, we would ask that you please type that in the chat box, and we will make sure to ask the question for you. Now please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Margaret Weitekamp.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Morgan. And thank you to the Atomic Museum. I've gotten such a warm welcome here already, and I am delighted to be here to talk to you a little bit about Space Craze. So I am going to turn this on. And whoop, double. All right. Light touch. There we go. All right, so I thought that I would start us, since this is a book that is based in the collections at the National Air and Space Museum, I thought I would start us with an object. And this is a trading card from 1936 from Buck Rogers in the 25th century. Now, Buck Rogers in the 21st century was one of the very first adventure comic strips ever in newspapers. So the very first one is Tarzan of the Apes from the Edgar Rice Burroughs novel, turned into a comic strip, and that was first published in January of 1929. Well, so was Buck Rogers in the 25th century, just a little bit later in the month. And that started actually from a story that Philip Francis Nolan wrote, and it started as a short story in a compendium called Amazing Stories. So these were called these pulp novels. The idea was relatively inexpensive paper, relatively inexpensive press, and they would put these either novels or collections of short stories together. And the short story that Nolan wrote was about this guy, Anthony Rogers, who was a pilot in the First World War. He was knocked out in a mine in Pittsburgh and wakes up in the 25th century. And the image that he sees, what becomes the very first strip, is this. which eventually becomes this 1936 trading card. So this is Wilma Deering. She is jumping with aid of her gravity-defying belt. So we've got technology, and we've got all of these kind of visual indicators right off the bat that we are far in the future from the beginning of the 20th century. Not least of which is a very independent, athletic woman taking care of herself. So we clearly must be far, far in the future. And so with this story then, the Dilley family, which owned a company that was basically syndicators. So back in the day, newspapers used to be printed every day. You didn't read them on your phone or on your computer. And they would be full of the day's news, but also of things that would be syndicated. So comic strips were one of those, advice columns, things like that, were sold to newspapers across the country by companies called syndicators. So the Dilley family and John Dilley approached the author, Nolan, about turning this idea that he had read in the short story into a comic strip. And the one critical change that they make is instead of the main character being known as Anthony Rogers, they decide to play on the popularity of Westerns at the time, and he becomes Buck Rogers. And so the very first strip was actually Buck Rogers 2429 AD. It's published in the 1929. And so then the next year it becomes Buck Rogers 2430 AD. And the next year it becomes Buck Rogers in the 25th century because they decide they're tired. It's clearly it has some legs, it's going to stay, and they're not going to change the name of the strip every single year. But this trading card is in the collection at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., which is where I work as a curator. Has anyone been to the National Air and Space Museum? Okay, very good. Wonderful collection of real aviation artifacts, real spaceflight artifacts, but also lots of these social and cultural artifacts, and that is what I work with. We also have our second facility out by Dulles Airport, the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. Has anyone been there? Ooh, very good. Okay. That allows us to put on display some of our larger things. The Space Shuttle Discovery is out there. SR-71 is out there. It's where we are able to really put our World War I, World War II aircraft. The Enola Gay is there. It's a place that allows us to really show off some of the bigger pieces of the collection. But what I work with are the smallest pieces of the collection in many ways. I'm the curator for, in addition to being chair of the department, I'm the curator for what we call the Social and Cultural History of Spaceflight collection, which means I work with our objects that kind of round out those stories that we tell with the hardware and with the operational pieces. So that can be things that are very rare. On the top left here, we're looking at a little medallion. It's about 1 inch in diameter. This was created by a jeweler in celebration of John Glenn's flight as the first American to orbit the Earth in February of 1962. He created one of these and gave it to Mrs. Annie Glenn, and he gave one to the Smithsonian. It's gold, it's set with some precious stones. So it can be kind of very rare pieces of memorabilia. And then it can also be kind of very everyday pieces of memorabilia. So this is a mission patch from the Space Shuttle mission STS-95, in which, 93, in which Eileen Collins became the first astronaut, the first woman to pilot the space shuttle. And so does anybody, pins, patches, stickers, that kind of thing, does anybody have any space memorabilia, a t-shirt, a coffee mug? So those kinds of everyday pieces can also be a part of the collection. We have things like box model kits, this Revell model kit, as much for the hobby of box modeling, being able to create models and thus really connect with what the objects were, but also for the cover art. This is a Vision, Everything is Go. This is the Mercury spacecraft separating from its Atlas booster. Obviously, this is not a vision that any person got to have in the early 1960s. This is an artist's vision of what it would be like to see from space those things separating. So that is an important part of the story that we get to tell. And then we have things in the top right hand, a little bit of a blend, not completely rare, but not every day. So that is a commemorative medal in celebration of Apollo 11. Part of what I like about this one is that the artist who was creating this for the Mint bothered to make the astronauts look like the astronauts. So that Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin, those three faces actually look like the three gentlemen who were a part of the first human landing on the moon in July of 1969. Sometimes you get just kind of three heads. Sometimes if they're really cheating, that just three helmets. But I like that the artist in this case took the time to get that detail right. And so we have an example of that kind of a collectible in the collection. And then we have the other side of this collection, which is space science fiction objects. So in this case, we've got a 25th anniversary credit card from Star Trek, some stickers from Star Wars. And so together, there are ways in which I really often think of this collection as the kind of most small d democratic collection. It's the kind of thing that most people have a chance of connecting with. Most of us don't design and build and fly spacecraft. But many of us have been fans of spaceflight or have gone to a space site or have wanted to follow along or just been a part of enjoying the imagination around what being a spacefaring species could look like that we've seen or read in science fiction. And these are the kinds of objects that tell that larger story. So I came on board at the museum in 2004 and almost immediately had a rough idea that it would have been great if someone else had written a book like this that could kind of walk me through what this collection meant, what it meant to have spaceflight be something that people were excited and preoccupied with in the 30s or in the 60s or in the 50s or in the 80s, and how those moments were different. But no one else had written it. So this is the book then that came out this past fall. In my time really working with the social and cultural collection, I saw a lot of connections between how spaceflight had been imagined and how spaceflight had been executed, and how those things were both really rooted in their time, and how that popularity about spaceflight over time, which I argue is something that is in some ways a kind of peculiarly American, not exclusively American, but there are unique ways that it is an American phenomenon. And I really wanted to kind of dig into what does that all mean and how can I use the collection at the museum to tell that story. So what I thought I would do tonight is walk you through kind of a little quick and dirty some of where I started with this and then some examples to give you a sense of what I was seeing as I was digging into this. In the end, it took me over 15 years because honestly, I had the idea of what this book could be. I didn't know enough to write it, and I didn't know enough to know that I didn't know enough to write it. So I kind of wrote bits and pieces over time, and then the more work I did with the museum, the more examples I had to pull things together, and the more I could really put some meat on the bones. So just because we are at a museum and I want to run you through where I started with this, it's a social and cultural history. So I'm a historian who deals with the history of ordinary people, social history. So not only presidents and generals and things like that, but ordinary people, and then cultural history, what is going on in the time. To do that, however, I think you really have to do lots of other kinds of history. You have to understand the politics of the time. You have to understand the business history of, if you want to know why something is with space science fiction, it's because it's show business, right? And that's the whatever the business model is, very often it's within those strictures that creative people are creating their visions. So I wanted to pull all of that together. And then I had started my career as a women's historian, so there's a way in which I see this as having a feminist framework. And by that I mean, I'm really self-conscious of where I am in this story. This is a story that I can tell uniquely in some ways because of kind of when and where I enter. So women's history, feminist history often really puts an emphasis on what is the situatedness of the person who is telling the story. And that's what I mean by this, is that I really start each chapter with a first-person account of me grappling with a thing, wrestling with a problem, trying to answer a question. And it's only because I have this unique position as the curator working with these objects that I'm telling this story, particularly in the way that I am, which is then to tell a kind of US-focused story, not because I think the US story is some universal thing, but because I think it's really culturally specific. And I think there are interesting ways that allows me to then tell a kind of fully rounded synthetic history that really runs from beginning to end. I spent a lot of time trying to write this book in slices. Could it be highlights of the cultural history? Could it be a series of vignettes? Could it be? And the answer in the end was no. It really needed to start with the Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon moment and run it all the way to the present. And it turns out that takes an awful lot of time to dig through. And then as a museum person, part of what I'm trying to do is bring kind of the latest scholarship to the public in plain language, right? That it's no good if people won't read it, if it's too complicated, if it's too jargon laden. It needs to be something that people can come in and really enjoy. And one of the fun parts of this kind of history is my audience knows so much about it, right? They've watched the shows, they've followed the space program, they've worked in these fields. And so almost every time that I give a talk like this, I've got folks in the audience who could say, well, actually, you know, I worked with NASA at this time, I worked on this program, I remember watching this when I was a kid, this is how that was understood at the time. And so it's about being able to meet people where they are with what they know, which tends to be a lot. So, with all of that, I was working with the collection, and one of the things that really was perplexing me at the beginning of this, as I was looking at these toys, and you do tend to get, there's a bias driven in the book by the fact that I'm working with objects, right? So I'm often working more with popular culture than I am with literary science fiction. There are not a lot of Isaac Asimov action figures. So as a museum person, I'm starting with stuff. I have to be able to touch it, put it on a stand, put it in a collection. And this was some of the stuff that I was working with. So in the front here, we've got a Flash Gordon pistol from the 1950s. On the right-hand side, the yellow and red one is a Buck Rogers toy gun from the 1930s. That's actually a water gun. It has a little leather pouch inside the metal that you could fill with the water and then shoot your friends or siblings with it. Behind that is one from Taiwan, the Space Jet. And next to that then, a laser gun. So one of the places where we see that's from the 1960s, and lasers, of course, were invented in 1960. So lots of different colors, lots of different shapes, kind of wildly different designs, and yet all instantly recognizable. Those are ray guns. That's what that is. Phasers, blasters, atomic pistols, ray guns. Why small arms, a small handheld sidearm, as ubiquitous in our space stories, right? I was talking to a docent at the museum one time, and he was saying, like, that makes no sense, right? A pistol is only really good, he would say. He was taught by someone in the military when he mustered in, you know, pistol's only really good in a knife fight. You know, and you certainly don't want anything that shoots any sort of projectile or that creates holes in things in space, and it doesn't make sense as a weapon in the kind of vastness of space. So why is it then that so many of our space stories have guns in them? And that is one of the questions I started with. I often think that if you look at kind of what is the popular culture vision of a curator when they show up in a TV show or a movie. They just spout facts. They know tons of stuff. They know all of the things. And I think that actually what curators do often is ask an awful lot of questions. Why is that the way it is? And how can I figure out something about that? Because the guns are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, especially in Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. And so on our left here, we have Buster Crabbe in the character of Buck Rogers with his youthful sidekick, with his gun at hand. The Big Little Book, also from the 1930s. These are not cherry-picked images. This is kind of typical of how Buck Rogers was presented. And in many ways, I came to understand and to argue that it's a part of a fundamental form of American science fiction that I think a lot of people have noticed but not necessarily fully explained or dug into, is the ways that these are really based on Westerns. There we go. And I think that that says important things about American national identity and about how those are pulled together in the way that we imagine ourselves in space. So what I'm going to do is this brief little, hang on, it's a 3-slide little diversion into US history. Thomas Jefferson and a number of the founders had this fundamental idea that what was going to make the American experiment different than Europe was going to be the availability of land, right? So if in a European context you tended to have inheritance laws, primogeniture and entail, which says everything has to go to the first son and it all needs to stay together. And the answer, the reason, the rationale for that is because you need to be, if you keep subdividing your land every time you have children, very quickly you have parcels that are too small to support people. But in this new American continent, you were going to have a lot more space. And that was going to allow American democracy and American freedom to really flourish because you would have enough space for this. So Jefferson in 1803 purchases the Louisiana Purchase. It's 4th grade or 8th grade, somewhere flashing back to how this was going to go. Manifest destiny was the idea at the time that all of this land that Americans were divinely going to fill. But he thinks that this is a pressure valve. He thinks that he has purchased American liberty and American democracy for the next 100 generations with that much land in 1803. Now the problem is it lasts until 1890. Not a problem. But it is one of the things that is distinctive is in the 1890 census, it's the first one where they say that all of the previously considered to be unoccupied space, there's no more unexplored, unsettled land in the contiguous United States, which was all of the US at the time. The frontier has closed. And so Frederick Jackson Turner, the famous American historian, goes to the American Historical Association, and he gives this really important paper, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, which becomes known as the Turnerian Frontier Thesis, or and we would now say the myth of the American frontier, which is this idea that the frontier has been fundamental to American national identity as it has been developed, that Americans are inherently explorers, they are hardy, they're inventive, and they are shaped in their national identity by this encounter with the frontier. Now, notably, in both of those slides, they're completely ignoring the idea that anybody already lived there, or that there was a viewpoint to be had other than landed white men. But the idea is very much that the West has been settled by the 1890 census, and very quickly after the frontier is considered to be closed, after the United States is now becoming more urban than agrarian and more settled, the West begins to be mythologized. And so you have things here like the Virginian, 1902, which is Not the first Western, but it's the first cowboy novel. It sets a lot of the conventions for how this is going to be thought about in American popular culture. And it is really a part of then advancing this idea that this unsettled West, that the frontier was critical as a site for social freedom, common sense, justice often at the point of a gun, the kind of rugged individualism, a whole set of values that are rooted in this idea of the frontier. All right, we've survived the 3 slides worth of historical background. So why is that a part of this lecture on Westerns and space science fiction? And in many ways, it's because a lot of the conventions that get set up in the American Western as a popular culture form are then translated almost directly into what I call the Buck Rogers archetype. So on the left, we've got the ad for the 1929 film of The Virginian, starring Gary Cooper. And on the right, then, we have the advertisement for the movie serials from the 1930s. I showed you that still of Buster Crabbe playing the character of Buck Rogers. When you went to a movie palace in the 1930s or through to the 1950s, is anybody far back enough in your childhood to, all right, there we go. The movies were just playing. There was not a time that the movies started, right? So you'd have a first feature, a second feature, a newsreel, a cartoon, and a movie serial, which was something that was a story that was chopped up into pieces, and you would come in and you would watch whatever movie you watched. You would watch the newsreel, you might watch the cartoon, you would stay for as long as you wanted. That's where the expression, "this is where I came in," right? So you might have watched your way all the way around the cycle. You could stay longer if you wanted, or you would leave earlier. But the movie serials are one of the ways to try to get you to come back every week. So we're gonna do an adventure story. It ends, almost every little episode ends on a cliffhanger. Our hero is in great danger, great trouble. You need to come back next week and come see what happens. They make a set of movie serials about Buck Rogers. They make a set of movie serials about Flash Gordon. And Buster Crabbe, former Olympic swimmer turned actor, plays both Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon in the movie serials in the 1930s. And one of the things that really struck me as you look at the kind of commonalities between these Westerns and the archetype that's set in the Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon universe is the commonalities. So a core cast that tends to start with our muscular, often blonde hero, who has a youthful sidekick who's helping him out, an older, avuncular advisor, think kind of your Doc Holliday kind of figure, tends to have a female lead who's a part of the crew, who is plucky, who has a lot of moxie and a distressing tendency to get captured. And you put that kind of core crew on a named ship in the Western. We knew not only the names of the heroes, but of their horses, right? So it's not only Roy Rogers, but Trigger. Think about Westerns and the way that, you know, the Millennium Falcon, the Star Trek Starship Enterprise, named characters in the story, have some personality, and then they are heading off for adventure, often at the point of a gun. One of the things that really struck me as I was putting all of this together, I'd kind of seen all these pieces. I think we'd all seen all these pieces for so long that nobody had really named them as something. And I was reviewing a piece that a colleague had written on Korean science fiction. And one of the things that's really important in Korean culture, it's very rooted in the land, it's very rooted in the community. And so a lot of Korean science fiction, to the extent that it exists, is about future Koreans in Korea doing Korean things. And it really struck me like the first thing you do in an American space story is leave. Right? You gather your group, you get on the ship, and you're heading to a space-based place for some sort of adventure. And you know, from there, things continue. So I really wanted to look at the ways that when you start with that archetype that I think has been so obvious and so exported and then reflected back to us that we haven't necessarily named it. what happens when you kind of follow that through time. And what I was really looking at then is what you get with these kinds of toys. So in the top right here is the first three-dimensional Buck Rogers gun that was made. It is the XZ-31 rocket pistol that was made in 1934. There's a whole set of stories to be told about that and the kind of price wars between the major department stores in the major East Coast and cities in Chicago. Also, as they tried to undercut each other in the holiday season of 1934. There were department stores that instead of having a Santa had a Buck Rogers Adventureland for their big holiday display. So Buck Rogers was very big in this Depression moment. And then we've got a prototype of the gun on the top left, and the one down in the middle is the one that came out in 1935, and that's the Wilma Deering gun. It's a slightly smaller one. And it makes it a little bit more affordable in this Great Depression moment, but it also allows girls to act as a part of the play. And one of the things that I started thinking about with this, as a scholar I was reading, there's lots of manufacturing histories on toys. Where do they come from? How are they distributed? What are the stories about how they're priced and how they're advertised? There's lots of anthropological literature about play and how important play is and how important it is in terms of learning not just, kind of what kinds of vehicles are, what farm animals say, but ideas about kind of the way things should be done, gender roles, all kinds of things get taught through play. But in the midst of all of this, I also became the parent of 3 children. And so I started thinking also a lot about kind of the physicality of this, the point of view. Who are you when you were playing with these toys? And throughout the book, I started doing what I now think of as these kind of embedded close readings. And it's based in some ways on literature by Robert Bernstein, and she is at Harvard, and she was looking at things that she called them scriptive things. So there's a bit of a script that comes often with a thing, how it should. So you pick this up and you know how you would hold that. You don't grab it from the muzzle end, right? You would grab that, you understand how you would hold that, and it comes with a bit of a point of view. And the point of view that is built into this toy is that you embody the hero. So because in both Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, the hero is our kind of white, blonde, muscular hero. Buck Rogers is fighting the Mongol hordes who have taken over the United States, and then he kind of heads off into other planets, other worlds. So very much a part of the kind of anti-Asian sentiment that was an everyday part of the world in the 1930s. In Flash Gordon, it is personified with the character of Ming the Merciless. And Flash Gordon is created very much in 1934 with the idea of capitalizing on the popularity of Buck Rogers. These toys are selling out. The comic strips are tremendously popular. There are radio programs. So Flash Gordon gets created in order to capitalize on that. So I started thinking about these objects in terms of there's no enemy gun. There's no Mongol horde gun, there's no Ming the Merciless gun, there's no assumption that some child will embody that alien other. The assumption is that any child could embody that blonde hero male point of view. Now, can you play against type, right? Can you pretend that's a baby doll? Can you do some? Of course, kids do that all the time. And that's part of what Robin Bernstein would talk about with scriptive things, this idea that there's a script, and then with that, there's a lot of play. So I was really looking at these toys and thinking about how they get used and who are you when you're playing with them. So I've spent a lot of time, probably more time on guns than you might have expected from a space talk. But I thought I'll do a quick side note to this. I thought about taking this slide out, and my daughter, who had seen me give a version of this talk, said, no, you have to leave this in. Because I think sometimes every place, many toy boxes in the 30s, 40s, 50s had guns, right? So the guns are not unique to a space story. There are 6-shooters, there are cops and robbers guns, there are Tommy guns to pretend you're a gangster. There's all kinds of toy guns in that era. This is a very different kind of toy. This is the Buck Rogers Junior Caster set. So if you think the guns are perhaps not the most appropriate toy for a child, this is a set of 2 molds that are held together by that clamp, and it comes with lead bars so that you can melt the lead and make your own action figures, which you then could paint. So this is something that in some ways was seen as, I think the past is a different time. There is some expectation that perhaps, probably the father has a workshop and that perhaps would be guiding this, although I don't know, somebody's got to at some point decide to get their mom to let them melt lead in the kitchen so that they can make their own toys. It's a toy that makes a little bit of sense in the Great Depression, when you might then be continuing to make pieces that you could give to your friends or that you could sell, or that, so it's a bit of a make your own fun kind of toy that doesn't just give you a single thing, allows you to replicate multiple things. But anyway, in the unusual things from the past, that is the Junior Caster set, and there was a version for Flash Gordon as well. And we've talked a little bit about Flash Gordon, and this is one of the pieces that comes from the late 30s, early 1940s. Flash Gordon is the imitator to Buck Rogers, and then in some ways it's literally and figuratively flashier, right? It's bright red, it's not black, it's bulbous, it's streamlined, it's kind of borrowing all of these aesthetics from the streamlined modern from that era. And so some of these toys I think are wonderfully evocative when we start to look at that, but we've got these guns not only from Buck Rogers but from Flash Gordon as well. And here we have Buster Crabbe in the center playing the character of Flash Gordon, and he is holding on to, on the far right of this image, Charles Middleton, the white actor who was playing Ming the Merciless in these 1930s movie serials, and who then, I argue, sets up a whole aesthetic of who we think of as the alien. We've got the kind of the peaked eyebrows, the Fu Manchu mustache, this kind of Asian supervillain is very much a part of what the expectations were in the 1930s for how this would be done. And that has kind of far-reaching implications, because there are ways in which science fiction is kind of seen as a little bit predictive, right? In a way that other genres don't necessarily have that burden. And so the vision of what is set up in the 1930s in these space science fiction stories then gets translated over time. So I'm going to jump ahead and talk a little bit about how this comes to be in the 1950s, and how this becomes a slight variation on this with television. So Space Patrol began as a science fiction television show. It was a local show in Los Angeles, and then it became a national television show. And if we're talking about our core cast, then and the ways that that kind of fits this Buck Rogers archetype, we have in the center here Buzz Corey, our muscular hero. Next to him is Cadet Happy, our youthful sidekick. On the other side of him is Chief Security Officer Robbie Robertson, who is our older avuncular advisor. I'm not just making this stuff up. It's there and the evidence supports it. In the front here, we have the character of Carol Christie, who is one in the story. She's the daughter of one of the generals in this story, but the love interest and also co-adventurer. And then we have a second female character here, the single named character Tonga, who used to be an alien, who is an alien, who used to be kind of an evil alien and is now a part of the core cast. And you know she was alien and different because she's a brunette. Right, so even some of these very small bits of difference, physical difference, and that's one of the threads I follow through the book, are the ways that the alien gets figured in these stories. And whether it's through hair color, whether it's through gigantism or dwarfism or some other physical difference, we imagine the alien, we imagine the other, and it then tells us a lot about who we think we are and who we as viewers are imagining ourselves as a part of this cast. So I tell this story both because the core cast of Space Patrol, which is not atypical for 1950s kiddie science fiction television. It fits the Buck Rogers archetype so well. It takes it into this new genre of television, and space science fiction was a very popular genre in part because television, the world was so politicized, and so they wanted things that seemed very apolitical, and space science fiction seems on the surface of it like it would fit that it's not a part of the Red Scare, it's not a part, it's not controversial in any of those ways. And it also gets translated into toys. This came to the museum from Michael O'Hara, who was a collector, and when he gave to the museum in the 1990s his collection of over 2,000 pieces, he started as a fan of Buster Crab, and so started collecting Buster Crab memorabilia. That turned into Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon memorabilia. That turned into a giant space science fiction collection, and then he decided to give the entire collection to the National Air and Space Museum. But he really wasn't sure about giving this playset. And that's because it was his when he was a kid. It wasn't something he bought as a collector. It was something he played with as a kid. And how intact it is, I think, says something about how much he was, even as a kid, he was destined to grow up to be a collector. But these kinds of play sets were really very popular in the 1950s. And so I'll show you a different one, which is the Superior Spaceport set. So these are essentially Western forts set in space. And in fact, the toy would also have been sold with this lithographed metal fence that you set up with the little pieces, and then you put the building in the middle, and then you have all of the little figures that go with it. There would have been versions of this set that would have looked like a Western fort with the logs as the fence, and that would have come with little plastic cowboys and Indians. And my colleagues at the National Museum of the American Indian have written very passionately about how damaging it is to grow up in a nation where you are the literal little plastic enemy. And these sets were very much that kind of us versus them. I think there are ways in which they fit very much a Cold War mindset that is concerned with kind of attack from without, subversion from within, and so these kinds of play sets were wildly popular. There were blue and gray Civil War sets, there were Western sets, there were the space sets, there were sets with pith-helmeted explorers and bug-eyed Africans. So there are all kinds of ways in which the racism of the day is very much something that people are playing with without comment. In this case, when I was looking at these where we've got our kind of aliens versus astronauts, I was thinking not only about the ways that it fits with that mindset of the 1950s, but one of the things that, as I think really comes out of being a parent, this is a toy that only makes sense if you live in a house. If you live in a suburban house where your kid has their own room, or you have a playroom, or you have some place to set this up that's not in the middle of the apartment, because it takes some time to kind of put all of the pieces together and to set up all of the little guys and to figure out how you're playing with it. And so there are ways in which this really fits the moment of the 1950s where you have the rise of suburbs, where you have an increasing move not to multi-generational family homes, but to homes where you have a nuclear family with enough space to set this up, because that's an annoying toy. right? Like if someone sets that up in the middle of the carpet or in the middle of the dining room table, then you either have to wait until they're done with all the play with it and get them to put all of the pieces away, or you're going to get all kinds of lip about, I'm not done and I need it all to stay out, and you're going to have to work your way around it. So this is one that makes sense in a world where kids have their own rooms or a playroom or a living room, and that fit with that baby boom moment in the 1950s and the rise of suburbs. So I've shown you a bit of what these kind of core casts look like. This is a film, When Worlds Collide, that's based on a Philip Wiley, Edwin Ballmer novel from 1932. It's a George Powell movie from 1951 about a kind of a space age arc. Chesley Bonestell, the famous space artist, is one of the technical advisors on this. And at risk of spoiling a movie that came out in 1951, you've had a moment to catch yourself up on it. You could have seen it if you needed to. This is about a planet that is there's an errant star. It's tugging a planet behind it. And it is going to ruin Earth, and all of the Earthlings need to get off, and you need to then repopulate the human race on another planet. You start the movie with a kind of global sense of discovering that this terrible threat is coming, and there are literally kind of a UN moment with lots of people with very different national costumes, lots of languages being spoken as they're figuring this out. But as the movie goes on, we focus increasingly on the American effort and on the American arc. And I think I don't have to point out too hard the boy, girl, white, young, other than the boy and the dog, who have been added to the complete uniformity of this, of who is going to repopulate the human race. So now space science fiction, we've said, is seen sometimes as a bit predictive. It's not different than any other television or movies at the time, which were very segregated in both how they were produced and how they were consumed. But there were ways in which it sets expectations for the genre, and it also sets some expectations for what people thought the future might be like. And it was part of why, when Gene Roddenberry creates Star Trek in the mid-1960s, which is a mixed race cast of men and women going into space together, even with a half alien as a part of the group, not the enemy held to the other end. That is a radical new vision of what it would be like to go into space. And so you have a character like Sulu on the far right, played by George Takei, which is a kind of radical new vision of Asian American, an Asian character going into space as a part of the group, not as the Asian supervillain threatening the core group. Nichelle Nichols in the red right next to him is really important, and we're going to come back to her. But I think it's worth pointing out that when this goes to air in the mid-1960s, it's in the midst of the civil rights movement in the United States. It's at the very beginning of the second wave of the women's movement in the US. And so it is a reflection of these social changes that are being dealt with on a national level, and Roddenberry takes some of that and says, I can do interesting things with that in terms of space science fiction. So this Buck Rogers archetype of who gets to do the adventuring on the named ship at the point of a gun heading out to a space-based place for adventure is malleable, it's flexible, it changes to reflect its time, and it does that in some really powerful ways. Now, I've talked a lot about space science fiction. The book is equally about space science fiction and the execution of actual spaceflight. And so I'll take us now to, I'm looking at the commonalities between how spaceflight has been imagined and how spaceflight has been executed. And the same kinds of evolving social, cultural, political contexts that are shaping the ideas about what it might look like to adventure in space are also in their own ways shaping what's possible in terms of actual space exploration. So this is an extraordinary group of gentlemen. These are the Mercury 7. These are America's first astronauts, chosen by NASA in 1959. And at the time, the homogeneity of the group would have been seen as a sign of their selectedness, right, of their excellence. These are an extraordinary group of men who have gotten to the top of the military pyramid as jet fighters, as test pilots, and who have been selected for this extraordinary duty of being the first Americans in space. But even they were very aware of how homogeneous this group was, of all white, Christian, married, heterosexual men who married with children, even in this extraordinarily dangerous job, because that was seen as an important marker of psychological stability in the selection of them. They were so aware of their uniform look that they sometimes lined up in alphabetical order to make sure that the media would get, that the press would get their names right. So from the left to the right, we have Carpenter, Cooper, Glenn, Grisham, Schirra, Shepard, and Slayton. So as I said, it's a really extraordinary group that starts American human spaceflight. It is a reflection of the efforts, the Cold War efforts at the time, to have them going into space. But to jump way ahead, it's part of where a group like this, there's a lot more in the book about the 60s and 70s, but I'm going to jump ahead to this class of astronauts that's announced in 1978. And this is the group of 35 astronaut candidates who are the first crew, the first group that are selected specifically to train for the space shuttle program. And by the late 1970s, as a reflection of its time, you can't have an astronaut corps that looks quite that exclusive. They need to be able to have an astronaut corps at NASA that reflects the face of America. They explicitly go out and are trying to do some recruiting for that. And so this group of 35 includes the first 6 women to be selected as astronaut candidates, 3 African-American men, and 1 Asian-American man. And so I'll run top. From the left is Guy Bluford, who becomes the first African-American in space in 1983. On our second row in the middle, we've got Anna Fisher on the left, and in the middle, Fred Gregory, who becomes the first African-American deputy administrator of NASA, in addition to being an astronaut. In our middle row, we have 3N Shannon Lucid, as well as then Ron McNair, who was tragically lost on the Challenger in 1986. In that second to the last row from the left, Ellison Onizuka, Judy Resnick, Sally Ride, and then second from the right is Ray Seddon. And in the bottom, finishing out this, we have Kathy Sullivan as the 6th woman to be a part of this group. So this is a new group chosen in a new way to do a new thing for a new vehicle. But when they were first doing the recruiting, they looked through the applications. They wanted to see more women. They wanted to see more people of color. They knew that they were recruiting researchers, Ph.D.s, people with medical degrees. That was a group that had many more diverse possible applicants than, say, military jet test piloting. But they also realized that they had a legacy of past discrimination. People who were talented, who had these advanced degrees, weren't necessarily applying to the space program, and so they ended up needing to go and recruit. And where they could find a vision of men and women of different races going into space together was Star Trek. So NASA Administrator James Fletcher actually hires Nichelle Nichols, who we see here, in a promotional film from the late 1970s. And so having played the character of Nyota Uhura on Star Trek, she now goes and campaigns for NASA with the idea that there's space for everyone. And so this is one of the films that she did with Apollo astronaut Alan Bean, where she's actually promoting the idea that NASA is in fact not only open, but really recruiting and welcoming for different kinds of people to be astronauts. And so someone like Dr. Mae Jemison, who becomes the first African-American woman in space, directly credits this public relations campaign with changing her mind about what might be possible for her. So I'm going to skip us kind of quickly to the end. For space science fiction, Star Wars is an absolute game changer. The genre was kind of dead by the late 70s, and this is around that same point that Nichelle Nichols would have been recruiting. Star Wars becomes an absolute blockbuster, and it really changes the game in terms of merchandising. Previously, you would not have created merchandise for a movie. They come and go too quickly. That's not really going to sustain toys. But George Lucas knew what he had. He sold the rights to this small company. Most of the large toy companies passed on the chance to create merchandise for Star Wars. It is this tiny little company from Cincinnati, Kenner, that's actually a part of General Mills. And they create these little action figures. And so if we think about our kind of embodied, embedded, close-looking, what do we see with these toys? One, you've got a combination of human and alien figures all together. Star Wars toys were a game changer in terms of toy marketing because both boys and girls were equally likely to play with them. They were made specifically on this size, not the kind of big G.I. Joe Barbie-sized dolls, but something that you could hold in your hand, and so that you could play multiple roles with them, not necessarily as an us versus them, but acting out any number of stories. And then they come with these collector cases. And inside the collector cases are little spots for each of the figures, but they're different shapes, right? There's a little short one for Yoda, and there's a little short one for R2-D2, and there's a tall one for Darth Vader, and there's a tall one for our Stormtrooper, and there's little labels that go inside. So you really, if you get one of these cases, you need to have all of the action figures. They're going to match all of your labels. And in fact, the card backs for Star Wars toys are a visual catalog of how many action figures have been produced up to that time. And you could like check off how many of them you had. So there are many ways, there are lots more Star Wars stories to tell. But this fundamentally changes how they're being played with, what the expectations are, and then it begins to move into this idea that this is not just something you play with, but that's something that you collect and that you want some completeness with. So I'll jump us all the way to the end of the book. When Smithsonian Books picked this up, they liked the book, but they really wanted something that would bring it all the way to the present. So in the last couple of months, as I was editing the entire thing, I also wrote an entirely new chapter about the now. And so this is one of the pieces that was included in that. This is a helmet from Halo. If anyone recognizes the Master Chief character from the Halo video game created for the Xbox franchise, this is an example of what popular culture scholars would call transmedia storytelling, where you've got a story that's told in a video game and then it gets translated, it gets turned into comic books. There was briefly a Halo television series. I'm not sure that caught on enough that it's going to turn into something sustained, but this helmet was created for the idea that you could wear it and do kind of promotional events and go out and visit kids at hospitals or things like that. The character of Master Chief is deliberately, it's every man, it is everyone. So when you play the video game, you see out this helmet. And when you ever see this character from the outside, that reflective surface on the helmet means that it just reflects the kind of space-based world that that character is in. Clearly male, but the idea that every character embodies this and that you don't ever see. I think in the TV show they did show you Master Chief's face, but the idea that usually in the video game world that you didn't see the face of this 25th century Spartan super warrior who was wearing this kind of a spacesuit. And so with the book, I'm able to kind of follow these stories up to the present day. And I think part of what was very gratifying is seeing the ways that the arcs that I had started drawing in the earlier chapters really do come to fruition in the end. So on our left here, we have a Falcon 9 from SpaceX, named after the Millennium Falcon, because Elon Musk is a big fan of space science fiction. On the right here, we have a vehicle from Blue Origin. Jeff Bezos is also a big fan of space science fiction, but he has 2 new vehicles. The suborbital vehicle is called the New Shepard. It is named after Alan Shepard, the first American to do a suborbital flight. And the new orbital vehicle is called the New Glenn. It is named after John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth. So there are really important ways that those formative stories about space imagination, whether real or imagined, are being then feeding into what is being built right now with this latest space industry. So in Space Craze, I'm really looking at how spaceflight has been imagined and how it has been executed, and how the commonalities between those social and cultural contexts, I think, are really important because they're powerful, also because they can adapt quite so much to what's going on at the time. And so it has been a pleasure to get to share this with you this evening, and I thank you for your patience. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes, sir.
No problem. So a few questions. The first is saw your picture of the firearms, and the firearms weren't very realistic.
Yes.
Was there a reason for that?
I think one of the reasons the firearms aren't very realistic looking is they're attempting to make them look futuristic so that they have the kind of core commonality with the Western, but as a toy, as a prop in the story, that they look like they're from the future. And one of the stories on those is that when they were initially creating those toys for Buck Rogers, which were made by Daisy Manufacturing in Plymouth, Michigan, one of the things that they did is they realized it was too expensive and too cumbersome and not practical to create as a toy what had been drawn in the comic strips. So they created a different form of the toy, and from then on the comic strips were drawn to include that as the gun. So all of a sudden the gun goes from having all of these very fluted, very expensive, easily broken pieces to being a much more compact thing with a simple flare at the end of the muzzle. So I think that's part of it, is that they're trying to signal the futureness of it.
Okay. I've got a few more if you guys are okay with me hogging this. The second one is with the candidates from the, I think, 1978 space program.
Yeah.
I understand they wanted more diverse, but how did they factor in the required skill sets? What I mean is, like, John Glenn, from what I know, he really needed to know how to fly an aircraft and fly a plane, or even Apollo 11. They need to land that sucker on the moon. So I'm wondering, how did they factor diversity while also making sure sufficient skill set?
So the answer to that is that it's the Space Shuttle program, and the idea with the Space Shuttle orbiters is that you need people who can fly and land them, and that's the commander and the pilot. There are no co-pilots in space. Nobody goes in space to be a co-pilot. So there's a commander and a pilot. The pilot is the co-pilot. And they are still coming out of that military flying tradition. So Eileen Collins and Pam Melroy, who's currently the deputy administrator of NASA, were both pilot astronauts. So that's its own track. And you eventually have more people of color, more women in that track. But the idea for mission specialists was that you're going to use the payload bay, the mid-deck of the space shuttle, to do all of these experiments. And that meant that you needed 5 to as many 7 people per flight. So you needed one commander and one pilot, and then you needed 3 to 4 to 5 to 7 to, other astronauts who were going to be doing all of these other things. that opened up all kinds of stuff. So they were looking for people with research degrees, so Ph.D.s, M.D.s, who would be able to do that. That's a pool that has more people of color and more women since the 1970s, since people started pushing with the civil rights movement and the women's movement to have admission to those kinds of professional schools. But it also meant more international astronauts. Famously, the teacher in space was supposed to be the very beginning of kind of opening some of those slots up for, it was going to be a teacher in space, it was going to be a journalist in space. They were looking at, so the journalist in space, the odds-on favorite was Walter Cronkite. John Denver, the country star, very much wanted to fly. There were ideas about, all kinds of civilians that might be able to be a part of this kind of everyday space program. And literally, with the space shuttle, they did not fly with pressure suits. That NASA really bought into their own rhetoric that this was a shirt sleeve environment for an everyday, ordinary, operational space vehicle. And so they had helmets, but the little blue jackets and blue pants with the Velcro were what they launched and landed in until after the Challenger disaster of January of 1986.
Wow. And, last question.
Yeah.
Sorry, then I'll. So seems like a motif in just kind of what I've read, like Robert Heinlein has spacesuit will travel. You have Mother Thing and the more civilized aliens. You have the Venetians and Space Cadet also were far more civilized. Star Trek. Aliens are a lot more civilized, and so is there a motif, like while there was the Western violence shooter thing, that they thought space would be more civilized?
I think there's often the hope that space would be more civilized, and you tend to see, I didn't, skip over a bit of the 60s and 70s where you get both the very utopian visions of what would be possible in space and also very dystopian visions of we're going to just bring the worst of ourselves into space or find the worst of ourselves in these alien civilizations. So yes, there were depictions of other, that more advanced civilizations must surely have figured out many of these things that we're still struggling with. And then there are these kind of other visions of either we're going to find the worst of human traits or bring the worst of human traits out. So I think that richness in the storytelling is one of the things that makes it so fascinating for me as a cultural scholar, is that there are so many different places that you can dig into this. And then, we were just having a conversation about a show like The Expanse, which, jumps off of they've read and watched all of this other stuff, and then they're trying to build on, what can we do with this that's very different. And so the creators of The Expanse, who are two gentlemen who write under one pen name, started that storytelling thinking it was going to populate a video game, and then ended up with such rich storytelling, they decided it would be a series of novels, novellas. But they have explicitly talked about they didn't want it to be white guys in space, right? So they were explicitly starting with what's a really multiracial, multicultural view. And if you've seen The Expanse, it imagines humanity as a spacefaring species that's been in space for so long that kind of Earth has one government, Mars has a separate government, and those who populate the outer planets and the asteroid belt have their own culture, which has been historically very oppressed in terms of labor and other kinds of conditions. And then what happens with that as the basis of the storytelling.
Very cool.
So of all the artifacts that you have had the pleasure of cataloging and studying, what would you say is your favorite?
Who's your favorite child? So I'm going to cheat, and I'll do one kind of fictional and one not. So I'm the curator for the 11-foot studio model of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise. So in the 1960s, before computer-generated imaging, period, if you wanted a spaceship in your TV show or movie, you had to physically build one and then film it. And that's what that 11-foot, 200-pound model, it's largely wood, was. And that got you those opening shots of the original 1960s television series. And I led a restoration of that in 2014, 2015, that led to where it's now on display in the Boeing Milestones of Flight Hall. Had it there before we started rebuilding the National Mall building for the National Air and Space Museum. It's now back on display. And so that's a place where I've had my own kind of close encounters with Star Trek fandom, which I count myself as a part of, and then really working intensively on getting all of the details of that right? Fans are the harshest critics because we love it so much. And so we want it to be right and to be true to the kind of the spirit as well as the detail of this stuff. So that model is incredibly complex, and I have great affection for it and for the fandom around that ship. Has its own fans, and is in its own way a 1960s television star, and people encounter it in that way. So that's one, and then the other one I just wrote about for Air and Space Quarterly, which is the museum's new magazine, and within the first month of my arrival, I went back and checked the dates, it was like 3 weeks into my job in 2004, we received a bracelet that came from Toni Foster, who was the wife of Robert Foster, who was an engineer that you've never heard of, who worked for McDonnell Aviation. And helped build the Mercury and Gemini spacecraft. He eventually worked at it's getting late in the day. What's the launch facility? Vandenberg, thank you. Vandenberg Space Center out in California. When he finished projects, he would bring her a charm for her charm bracelet. So it has a Mercury capsule, has a Gemini capsule, it has a Redstone rocket, it has an Atlas rocket, and it has 2 engraved jeweler's charms that came from classes that she taught when she was a teacher at the schools in Cape Canaveral. Because they moved the whole family down there and the kids grew up there. And his papers came into the museum's archives, but this bracelet came with it. And what I like about it is it tells the story of that couple and how her work supported his work, but also about how the whole family moved to the Cape, and then honestly about the way that town exploded 10 times or more in the 1960s and needed grocery stores and a decent theater and new elementary schools and restaurants and all of the things that people wanted to have in a town that was that big and that was that vibrant and supporting the space program. So that's my other favorite object because it's a very little thing, but I think it tells a story not only of him and of their relationship and what it took to support space work, but also of those whole communities that sprang up around space work in the 60s and into the 70s, 80s, and that still exist, places, Houston, Florida, that are really a vital part of what we now know as that vibrant space industry.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So you've mentioned a couple times the theme of the sort of the fanciful or the idea of space versus the actualization.
Yes.
Do you have anything that's kind of stood out as something that was like really beautifully conceptually just fanciful, but then once it got actualized, it maybe was a little bit more practical? Something that the disconnect kind of, I don't know, makes it a little bit more whimsical.
There's a whole category when I look at spaceflight imagination that I think of as speculative imagination. And so there were people like Wernher von Braun, Willy Ley. There was a whole host of writers in the 1950s who were imagining what spaceflight would really look like. So there was a series of magazine articles in Collier's magazine that were tremendously important. There were books about what it was going to look like to go into space. And they were based on kind of imagined what the real science was going to be, based on what would be realistic. And the place where that has not panned out the way that people expected is that they really thought that the pace of change that they had seen in the 20th century was going to continue unabated. So if you think about the Wright brothers invent the airplane in 1903, and Lindbergh flies the Atlantic in 1927, and by 1969, Neil Armstrong is standing on the moon, right? You could easily live through all of that in a very reasonable lifetime. And in fact, if you were a child, born at the very end of the 19th century, you might well have been a senior citizen watching men walking on the moon, and you would have, remembered that you were alive when the airplane was invented. And they really thought in the 1950s it was going to be a hop, a skip, and a jump, that we were going to go from, God bless you, any human being in space to space stations, huge orbiting space stations, and then bases on the moon, and then on to Mars, and that, clearly by the year 2000, we would be, going back and forth on shuttles to go to the moon or to go to Mars. Mars would probably be a longer, more arduous trip. But moon, clearly, low Earth orbit would be wildly populated. We have had human beings on the International Space Station continually since the year 2000. We have not all, as humanity, been on the same planet at the same time for 23 years now, 22 and a half. But we're not nearly where everybody thought we would be. Part of that is remote sensing, right? It turns out you can do all kinds of planetary exploration with, we've got a robot planet of Mars where we've been driving around, and I've got colleagues who are planetary scientists at the museum, and they know that geography as well as your hometown. And those are places that they can name and map, and they know where they are. And we're getting that with icy moons around outer planets where we've done all of this exploration, and it doesn't necessarily take a person, because those visions were built when you had to send a person, because they had to physically carry the celluloid film in order to get the pictures. And you couldn't imagine that you would be able to do things the way that we now can do stuff with just even sending digital images. So I think that's one of the biggest places, is where when you look at those visions, they are rooted in what would be possible if you kind of extrapolate 1950s technology, but also are, I think, really rooted in this idea that you've seen so much change in the 20th century very clearly by the 21st, which is impossibly far in the future. We're all going to vacation on the moon. Well, thank you so much for your attention this evening. There are still snacks and wine and things in the back. I'm happy to come and sign books. And thank you all for coming out. This is a wonderful institution. I'm happy to see you supporting it.